Good morning, all, and welcome to the second webinar in our free series of webinars organized by the University of the West Indies Cave Hill Campus's Center for Professional Development and Lifelong Learning, where our tagline is Lifelong Learning for Lifelong Earning. I'm Sonia Mahan from the UWI, and I will be your moderator for this morning's webinar. The purpose of the series is to expose those of you joining us to some of the tools that we are certain to prove useful to allow you to recenter, re-equip, and reimagine your professional and personal futures. COVID-19 has really taken us by surprise, and we all now have to adjust to the new normal, whatever that looks like, either in the short, medium, or long term. Before we get started, here are some of the protocols for this morning's webinar. For the duration of the webinar, each of your videos will be disabled and your microphones muted. It will be an interactive session, and we encourage you to use the chat facility to the right of your Zoom toolbar to engage with us. Should you be experiencing technical difficulties, do let us know through this chat facility as well. To get the best viewing experience, I recommend that you select the speaker view, put your application into full screen and select the speaker view so that you'll be just focused on the speakers this morning. Today's webinar is titled Leading Effective Virtual Teams, and our main speaker will be Professor B.J. Punnett, who is a dear friend of the Department of Management Studies, as well as the Center for Professional Development and Lifelong Learning. A bit about her. Dr. B.J. Punnett, a native of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, is Professor Emerita at the Cave Hill Campus, University of the West Indies. She holds a PhD in International Business Management from New York University and has published 8 books and numerous academic and practitioner papers. Her most recent books are Managing in Developing Countries, published in 2018, and International Perspectives in Organizational Behavior, which is in its 4th edition, published in 2019. She has worked with a variety of virtual teams and has been studying best practices for such teams for the past several years. In February this year, she presented a public lecture on the topic for the University of the West Indies. Professor Punnett now lives in St. Vincent in the beautiful Buckhamant Valley, where she works virtually. So, without much further ado, Professor Punnett, over to you.
Thank you very much. I think what I'm doing is correct. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Leading Effective Virtual Teams. It's very nice to meet you, even though it's only virtually. I want to start by saying that this is my first attempt at a Zoom webinar, but I have a great moderator in Sonia and a great technical team. So I'm sure that it will all go okay. And please excuse me if there are any unexpected glitches. I'm quite sure, again, we will sort them out if there are any. It's interesting to be doing this virtually because, of course, that's what the topic is all about. And I have been part of a number of virtual teams, and we've done team meetings, usually using Skype. But in this case, it's different because I know there are quite a lot of you out there, and yet I can't see you. And of course, I'm accustomed to being in a classroom where I can see people and I can kind of read their expressions and all of those kinds of things. And this makes it quite different. So it's an interesting experience for me, just as it is for you. Excuse me. I'm sitting here thinking of you in Barbados, but then I realized that that's not necessarily so. You might be in Trinidad or in St. Vincent or essentially anywhere in the world. So I was wondering if maybe you could let me know where you are attending from. Perhaps you could just give us some idea, you know, where you are physically. I guess.
Just let us know in the chat where you're from, and we'll just give you about another moment to say so. And BJ, Professor Punnett, we have this from all over the world. We have Canada joining us, Stephanie joining us from Canada, Elizabeth is joining us from Kingston, and we have a variety of former students as well joining us from Barbados.
That's exciting. It really makes it very neat to know that people can do it from anywhere. As I say, my first sort of imagination was people in Barbados, and then I realized there's absolutely no need for people to be in Barbados. I also was wondering where people were attending from, as in, are they at home? Are they in a home office? Or are they at their work office, or their normal place of work? Or are they somewhere else? Although I think the beaches in Barbados are closed, again, there's no reason that you can't attend from the beach or on your boat or on the golf course or all kinds of other places. So perhaps people could also give us some idea of where they physically are while they're attending this.
And from the flood of responses coming in, most people are at home. Some of them are working from their home office, and some of them are working from their home office in the patio. As Keith is saying here, he's on his stand-up deck.
Okay.
By far and large, persons are working from home, even if they have a home office set up.
Okay, sounds good. So, okay, nice again to meet everyone. And I'll just get started with the presentation, I think. You're quite welcome to interrupt and ask questions by the chat system, and Sonia will pass those on to me. And we'll also have a period at the end for questions and answers, so whichever you prefer. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead with the presentation. Okay, first, just a list of the topics to be covered. I just wanted to give you a definition of virtual teams, although it's probably fairly obvious. A little bit of information that I've picked up about the effectiveness of these teams. Then go through a couple of examples of teams, the benefits and challenges of these teams, some ideas on best practices, then a particular little feature on meetings, which doesn't just apply to virtual meetings, but does apply to them as well. A little thought about language when you're working in a virtual team, and leadership and management. And then very briefly to look at the impact of the coronavirus and how it has affected us, or how we expect it to affect us. Okay, so first of all, a definition. Excuse me again. A virtual team refers to a group of individuals working together from different geographic locations and relying on communication technology. So pretty much exactly what we are today. We are a virtual team. I have worked with a couple of virtual teams, particularly currently with a team that has a lot of members in different African countries, as well as in North America, some members from Canada, the US, Mexico, and of course the Caribbean. So we are really spread around the world in very different time frames and with different types of technology and different languages and ways of communicating and so on. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is drawn basically from my own experience. Although, you know, obviously I've done some research on it and, you know, read a lot of the literature and so on. So if we look at some news about virtual teams, these are what I called good news stories, but they are old. They are what I also call pre-pandemic. So these are studies that were done back in 2015, in 2017, 2019, and so on. But they all showed that people found working in virtual teams was positive. So first of all, there was the Gallup survey back in 2015 that found that 84% of people work in virtual teams at least some of the time. Now, I'm assuming that that's going to have gone up a lot right at the moment. Although I did try to get current information, and basically all I could find online was statements that said sort of, most people are working in virtual teams, or most people are working from home. So I didn't get any very definitive information. Although I will say, for those of you who are interested in looking at the topic in more depth, that there are a number of studies that are currently being undertaken and that you can find interesting information online. The Society for Human of this, and so if you go to their website, you can find interesting information. Okay, the second one here was something called global integration. And they found that virtual teams can be 40% more productive than co-located teams. Co-located simply means in the same place. I thought that was really interesting. And again, in trying to look for more immediate information, one piece of information that I kept coming across was that virtual teams can be very productive. So while there are some managers who probably worry that when they let their teams work from home, that the teams are not going to really be working, it seems in fact that we can be more productive because we can work at times that are best for us. And we don't have all the wasted time of going to work, sitting around the water cooler, whatever. So that's the good news. Okay, the Society for Human Resource Management report, they found that 60% of companies were offering some kind of telecommuting options. Again, obviously that's going to be much higher right at the moment. And there seems to be a general belief that once we come out of lockdown and pandemic and everything else, that a lot of companies will have experienced the benefits and that number will probably go up, so that more and more companies will probably, where possible, offer employees the option. Okay, then the Cisco survey said that 83% of telecommuting employees said their ability to communicate and collaborate with coworkers was the same as, if not better, than when working on site. Again, really interesting, because one of the things that we worry about, and one of the things that I have is a challenge to working in a virtual team, is the whole issue of communication and collaboration, because clearly there are parts of the communication process that are missing. On the other hand, what seems to be the case is that when people are doing this virtually, they take care and really think about the communication issues. Whereas we're so accustomed when we meet people in person to just saying things and assuming that the other person understood and so on. When it's virtual, we tend to be more careful. So those are all sort of the good news about the virtual team situation and what's going on. Now, as Sonia mentioned, I did a public lecture back in February, and I described telecommuting or working with virtual teams as the future of work. And I argued that, you know, there would be more of this because there were advantages to it and so on. Of course, today, when I'm doing this webinar, what is it, February, March, 3 months later, I would describe this type of work probably as the reality of work for many people. So in that very short period of time, we've gone from thinking of it as the future of work to thinking of it as just what we'll probably be doing. So it's just very interesting. Again, it would be interesting to know of the people who are participating, how many of you are actually working remotely or working virtually most of the time now. Obviously, there are still people who have to go to work. There are jobs that are done that can't be done virtually. But I think we're finding that it's surprising how many jobs can be done virtually. So again, maybe a quick chat note to tell me whether you're working remotely or virtually. And if not, those of you who aren't, maybe you could just mention what kind of work you're doing and why it's not, get a bit too long if you're going to tell us why it's necessary. I guess it will be obvious why it's necessary. By the way, as maybe we're doing that, is Barbados still pretty much locked down and shut up, Sonia?
Yes, we're still under, we're being reminded we're still under the 24-hour curfew, although more businesses have opened under this phase, and we are, fingers crossed, anticipating more businesses opening. So
okay.
Supermarkets and so on are still on an alphabet schedule. The banks are open, more of the electronic stores are open, and so on. So we're gradually coming back to some sense of normalcy. And the beaches are open now, not only from 6 to 9 in the morning, but 4:30 until 6 in the evening as well.
Okay.
Restaurants are open for deliveries and takeout, not in restaurant service. So we're getting there.
Interesting, because St. Vincent has never really locked down. Our stores are still open. I mean, there are not very many people in them because nobody wants to take the risk. But it hasn't ever been like it was in Barbados. So we haven't had quite the same experience.
Okay. We have some responses to your last question.
Okay.
So I'm just going to pick a few. Many people are still working, but many of the responses are that they're working from home. Gregory says that he works from home now during the curfew. It's harder though, more time consuming. We have Glenda, who is teaching online. When Jamal and Wendy are working from home. Wendy is working in transportation, so it's necessary to work in the office. And but most of the responses confirm what you were saying, that persons are working from home. Some are trying to keep themselves updated, so they're not working at the moment, but trying to engage meaningfully with the new environment. And Claire is working for the offshore company and always able to work from home. There was a response earlier that I wanted to read too. Alwyn is in human resources. And one of our respondents says that while she's back in the office, her team is virtual across the region and Canada.
Wow, that's really interesting. It's particularly, my next slide was going to say that there are different forms, and clearly what those responses indicate is that there are many different kinds of teams, many different ways of working virtually. So I just put together some thoughts about, some of the differences that in some cases it's the same company and the same division or department. So you could be the marketing department of something like Flow that's working on a new advertising campaign. That could certainly be done virtually. But it could also be the same company with different divisions or departments. So if you had the senior managers from different departments, HR, marketing, operations, and so on, developing a strategic plan. Or it could be different companies, but the same division or department. So HR departments, this of course was thinking of Barbados and the government curfew. HR departments of different supermarkets coordinating opening hours during the government curfew. Or in the case of LIAT, the same company, but different countries. So the LIAT operations managers from different countries establishing a new schedule. Those last two I thought were things that very likely have occurred. I mean, I didn't actually call LIAT, but it seemed to me that was probably what they were doing. So you can see from my examples and from the responses from everybody that virtual teams may be made up of people from lots of different countries, or they may be from the same country. They can have different time frames. They can have very specific things that they're setting out to achieve. So the operating hours during a government curfew, that would be in place for a very specific objective. And then once they had decided on that, that particular team might not meet anymore. Some virtual teams that I know of are very short term. They meet for a very specific goal, objective, and once it's done, that's the end of that. Others, like the ones I'm involved in, particularly the African one that I was talking about, which is working on a research project that we call Leadership Effectiveness in Africa and the Diaspora, that's been going on for years and probably will go on for years. We started off with a specific research project, and then out of that research project grew a couple of books that we've published and other research projects and development of teaching materials and so on and so forth. So, you know, it's grown and gone in different directions. And of course, they have different rationales. Some of them might be just so that you can get together and chat with fellow workers, particularly during the coronavirus problem. You might just want to be able to talk to the other people at work, just to say, hi, how's everything going? So you might have a virtual team that was more social than anything else. Most of them tend to have some fairly specific objectives, some fairly specific goals. And later on, I'm going to say that that's important. But sometimes those are long-term goals, so you know, you're going to go on for a long time. Other times they're very short-term goals. And depending on what your team is like, you'll obviously address problems, address challenges differently. And you'll have different forms of communication and so on. So I came up with a hypothetical example that this is totally hypothetical. So if anybody is there from Goddard's, I'm not saying that you're doing this. But Goddard Enterprises Limited describes itself on its website as a multinational group with businesses located throughout the Caribbean, South America, and Latin America that takes a dynamic approach to business spanning the catering, manufacturing, automotive, building, and financial industries. So my hypothetical part is that Goddard has decided to identify a global marketing approach to be used across countries and businesses. Now, in the past, what they probably would have done if they were really doing this was that a group of managers would have flown to a central location and spent days or weeks discussing options with lots of costs. All of the time that it takes, time people being away from work, plus dollars in terms of flights and hotels and meals and all of those things. And staff, because these managers probably have staff with them who can do research for them and all of that. So it would have been a major undertaking and an expensive undertaking. Many years ago, when Barclays and CIBC merged, they had a merger team in Barbados, which took up the entire ground floor of the FCIB head office. I have no idea how many people were there, but there were lots of people, probably at least 100 at some times. And UE was doing a series of cases on the merger. So we got to know a lot of the people quite well. You know, we did lots of interviews with them and so on. And one of the things that they mentioned all the time was the complexity and the cost of having all of these people co-located in one location in order to decide on the details of the merger. And it went on for at least a year. There were people who came in for short periods of time, people who came in for a long time, people who were there for the whole time. There were people from other Caribbean islands. There were people from the UK, people from Canada. So it was a big undertaking. Now I think they would probably meet as a virtual group to share ideas and consider how they can achieve their objectives. So they would stay at home basically and continue much of their routine work. They still might need to meet in person occasionally, but it wouldn't be the same big undertaking as FCIB's merger team. We have found in our teams that it really is nice to meet in person occasionally. And that's one of the things that I also will say in terms of the best practices, I think. But you can avoid an awful lot of those costs mentioned above if you can do an awful lot of it virtually. Actually, this is an important part too, because I remember the people at FCIB mentioning that basically when they came down to Barbados for a month or 2 months or whatever, the work that they normally did at home in Canada or the other Jamaica or wherever, you had to find somebody else to do that work. So it wasn't just the fact that they were away, but it was what happens to their job at home. Now that was a hypothetical example, but a very real example at the moment is the whole thing of dealing with the coronavirus. The WHO is working with government health departments, other global organizations, private companies, NGOs, various benefactors, as well as doctors, researchers, and probably all kinds of other people, all basically committed to finding a vaccine or a cure or anything that helps with the coronavirus. And this is all taking place virtually. Almost no one is flying anywhere to confer with colleagues. No one is meeting with like-minded people around real tables to discuss possibilities. I mean, there may be a few, somebody from the WHO may need to go in person and meet with somebody who's about to provide a few $1 billion or whatever. But for the most part, it will be done virtually. And there'll be all sorts of subgroups among these people that I'm talking about here. Some may be very short term. Obviously, those that are looking for a vaccine or something, not that they'll be short term, but they'll have a very specific objective. And once they reach that objective, their work will be finished. Others may go on forever because even if they find a way to deal with COVID-19, people will be concerned about future pandemics. And so there will be groups that will be very long-term in nature because they will not just be looking at the current situation, but at what happens next. So the coronavirus is clearly pushing us more and more towards virtual work. And I do think we're going to find that even afterwards, an awful lot of work will be virtual. So what are some of the benefits? I'm sure you can all think of lots of benefits, but what I tried to do was look at it from the really big picture down to the micro picture. So first of all, from almost an environmental position, much less travel, much less pollution. People are not commuting most of the time, so fewer cars, using less gasoline. This means less cost for many people. And the result has been all sorts of lovely stories about dolphins in the Ganges, blue sky over Shanghai, baby turtles in Florida. I heard a lovely report on the baby turtles the other day that because the Florida beaches were closed at this time, or at least this particular one was, and they had literally thousands and thousands of baby turtles that were making it to the sea, where normally they see very few. So maybe if we keep this up, we will have less CO2 and less climate change, and it will actually be good for the world. It's pretty hard to look at the coronavirus and the number of people who have died in the world and say that it was a good thing, but at least there may be some sort of silver lining to the cloud. From organizations' perspective, clearly if you're relying largely on people working virtually and working from home, it's going to save money. You won't need large office buildings. You won't need an office for everyone. You may need enough office space that people can meet in person from time to time, but you won't need anything as much as you would otherwise. That saves money on electricity and air conditioning and a whole bunch of other things. And is also probably good for the environment. But a second thing is that it takes advantage of the best talent that's available. And talent management has been a big topic in recent years. How do you find the best people and so on? And again, if you think about this webinar, normally up to recently, Dion would first have looked in Barbados to see, well, is there someone here who could run this webinar for us? And if he had thought, well, I think BJ would do a good job, he would probably have invited me to fly to Barbados. I would have stayed in a hotel for a few days, and I would have done the seminar in person. Now, of course, he doesn't do that, and he doesn't have the expense of bringing me to Barbados and putting me up in a hotel. He can have me do this sitting at home. And by the way, I asked you all where you were, and I am sitting at home. I'm actually at my dining room table. It took a little bit of finding to decide on the best place that I should be. But what you actually see behind me is my kitchen. So we're now able to look around the world basically and try and find the best talent. This is great from an organizational perspective. It's possibly a little worrying for some people. From an academic point of view, people have been concerned that if universities decide that distance education is just as good as in person, then nothing is to stop them from hiring somebody in India or Bangladesh or China to do their courses. And that means that for those of us who are local, it may put us at a bit of a disadvantage. And then also the whole idea of diversity. You can bring diverse people together in virtual groups much more easily. And that leads to more ideas, more innovation, more creativity. and so on. So I think organizations, once they realize that it's working, are certainly going to want to do more of this if possible. From an individual point of view, it saves the individual time. I can think of nothing nicer than not having to commute. I mean, when I lived in Barbados and I went to class, depending on the time of my class, I would have to leave way early in order to make sure I was there on time. And then I would sit in traffic for about an hour. And if I could have eliminated that, I would have been delighted. It would have given me more time to do other things. So it would increase your productivity. And maybe it's not more time necessarily to work, but if you start off with more time to exercise and have breakfast, then you're probably going to be more productive when you do work. So you can see a lot of reasons why maybe it does increase productivity. Individually, it also means that you get to work with the best people. This is a comment that comes up in our African group a lot, where our African colleagues, who often don't have the funding to attend international meetings and so on, they often say how nice it is to be able to work with colleagues from the US and Canada and the Caribbean, and that they can do it now because we can do it virtually, whereas before they just hoped that they might see these people if they could afford to go to an international meeting. And then from our home point of view, it means we have home offices, we have technology at home. All of that may be very useful to us, not just in getting our work done, but for other things as well. So there are really a lot of benefits that you can think of, ranging from the impacts on the environment to the impacts at home. So I think there are reasons that we might want to go this way, and hopefully some of these benefits will be real. Now, this was a picture that I found, which shows the change from pre-virus to post-virus. I believe this was in China, although I can't remember for certain. But certainly in China, where I was there many years ago and I went a few times, the idea of blue sky was unheard of. There was no such thing as a blue sky. And now there has been. Unfortunately, from the most recent information that I hear, since China has opened up again, their skies have gone back to gray. So it may not have the lasting impact that I'm hoping for, but I'm hoping that even in China, there will be enough people who will say, please, I liked the blue sky, and perhaps therefore it will continue. Now, of course, it's not all good. So there are lots of challenges for us to think about too. I better think about the time here as one of my challenges.
You're going fine, PJ.
Okay, great. I usually have a clock up on the wall and I don't. Different approaches to virtuality. Here what I'm thinking about is that some people like it. Some people flourish working at home and think it's wonderful and really like the fact that they don't have to get dressed first thing in the morning and that they can work whenever they want and so on and so forth. At the other extreme, there are some people who find it very, very difficult. There are some people who find that they can't get down to work, that they are wandering around and watering the plants and then cleaning the fridge or whatever, but finding other things to do as opposed to work. So you have to recognize in yourself how it is for you and then try and deal with your particular reaction to working virtually. Second is the whole lack of physical interaction. The more that we have been through this, the more people have realized that the human being actually likes to physically interact with people, with others. We've all seen these lovely stories about people finding ways to hug their grandparents through plastic whatever so that they don't give them the virus. But definitely we like physical interaction. There was a recent survey done with students about how they felt about working at home and, you know, distance education and so on. And some of their comments I thought were very interesting and I'm sure apply everywhere. They talked about the negative aspects, the lack of rich interaction. So they really missed the interaction. The lack of personal and social interaction, missing a sense of community. They said that the class atmosphere was perceived as dedicated to learning. Therefore, it facilitated concentration and interaction and clear boundaries between social, personal, and learning working boundaries. I thought all of those were really interesting. So they felt that when they went to the university, they knew what they were there for. And I think for a lot of people that may apply at work as well. When you go to an office and go to work, you know what you've gone there for. And there also is that difference between when you're there and when you're at home. One of the problems with working virtually that I've found is that sometimes you work too much because you never leave. So your office is there, your computer is there. If you suddenly think at 10 o'clock at night, oh, I need to send an email to ask about something, you'll go and send it. My son, who works in Canada, he was down here on vacation and his office in Canada kept calling him by Skype to say, what are we supposed to do about such and such? And it was like, he's supposed to be on vacation. Okay, and so interaction and discussion, they said they missed that was really important to them. And again, I think from a work perspective, that's one of the things, you know, you just happen to meet somebody in the office and you start talking about something and then good ideas can come out of that. So the lack of physical interaction is important. The lack of communication context, for example, nonverbal cues. As I said at the beginning, when I was trying to decide where to put this computer, I realized that some of the things I normally do are not obvious when I'm doing a presentation like this. So my students always tell me that I use my hands a lot when I'm teaching, and that they actually find that that's quite helpful. But I use my hands because I'm walking around. It doesn't seem appropriate to use my hands when I'm sitting still. So all of those kinds of cues you don't have. And normally in person, when I see my students, I'm getting feedback from them all the time in terms of whether they're looking interested, whether they're looking bored, whether they're actually on their cell phone or on their computer. And I don't have any of that feedback from you guys. So if you've all gone to sleep, I wouldn't know. And if you're all on your cell phones, I wouldn't know. So I wouldn't be able to change what I'm doing in response to those cues. So again, we have to kind of think about, well, what do we do about that? And in kind of the best practices, I suggest that you have to be even more aware of what cues you do get. So you have to really watch for those kinds of things and not take them for granted. In many virtual teams, you have to think about time differences. If you're all in different time zones, it can be very, very complicated to figure out when you can actually meet. my African colleagues are 6 or 7 hours ahead of me. So if I want to meet in the evening at 4 o'clock, that's very difficult for them. It's already nighttime. And China is about 12 hours different from us. So, you know, if you want to meet at 9 in the morning, that's 9 at night for them. Or it's 9 at night for you and 9 in the morning for them. So you have to really find times. It means people have to be flexible. Okay, I mean, I may prefer to meet in the morning, but I may have to be flexible and accept that it's better to meet in the evening because someone else, that's the only time they can meet. So you really have to think about the time differences and how to deal with them. Of course, you have the distractions of being at home. A little while ago, I don't know how aware you were of it, my dog had been outside and somebody let it in. And so, of course, it saw me at the dining room table and it immediately came over expecting that I should pet it. And I was trying to ignore it. So your animals, your children, you know, I've seen videos of people doing news broadcasts and the cat jumps up in their lap, you know, so there are all sorts of things that happen at home. And basically what you have to try and do is try and make sure that you minimize those. Another thing that's really important that, again, is coming out of particularly the coronavirus thing is the impact that it has on women. And whether we like it or not, women still do more of the homework than men do. So women are more likely to look after the children, do much of the cooking, do much of the cleaning, all of that. Even if we have absolutely wonderful spouses or partners who help us a lot, for some reason, we still do more of it. So I saw a rather disturbing study, again, for academics, that through the coronavirus lockdown, women's submissions of papers to academic journals has dropped by 50%, while men's submissions have increased by about 50%. And I mean, that really worries me. As academics, our promotion and tenure and all those kinds of things depends on our submissions to academic journals. And the idea that women would be so distracted by what's going on that they're no longer submitting as much is not a good thing. So clearly one has to deal with that. And if you are a woman, it becomes very important to identify how you're going to deal with it, how you're going to make sure that you have enough time to do the work that you need to do, and perhaps where you can do it and things like that. Okay, our technology is another challenge, and it is imperfect technology, but it is evolving. It's getting better all the time. But a few days ago, when I was first going through the material that I would use in the presentation for this webinar, we had no electricity. And that's not unusual in St. Vincent. Our electricity gets cut off on a regular basis. It's intentional. It's not because we had a storm. It's for maintenance. So obviously I have to know when that's going to happen if I'm going to try and do something like this. Another day, we didn't have any internet. And so I thought to myself, well, I do hope that on Wednesday we have internet because I don't know what I'll do otherwise. So you have to deal with the technology that we have and make the best of it. It's also can be different in different places. So again, when I'm talking about Skype meetings with colleagues in Africa and elsewhere, some people have really good internet and some people have very slow internet. And so we have difficulties that we just have to deal with. Then finally, particularly this has come up again with the use of things like this, that there are security concerns, that it's not necessarily secure online. A story that I heard from Canada was a city councillor meeting. There were about a dozen people at the meeting virtually, when suddenly they were interrupted on their screens by images of child pornography. Obviously horrific. They didn't know why, they didn't know how. As far as I've heard so far, they still don't know why or how. So there may be some topics that you just don't want to deal with on any technology that may be not totally secure. So again, you have to think about that. Basically, looking at the challenges, the idea is to see how you're going to manage them, to recognize them. And I may not have all here. You may have experienced other difficulties and challenges. And in fact, if you would like to, again, send us notes about, other things that you should be thinking about, that would be great. Okay, so that's the challenges. Then I have some best practices, which basically just come out of these. Be prepared. Once you have to work with a virtual team, think it through, think about what's going to be involved. Think about those challenges and how you're going to deal with them. Don't assume that it's just like normal. To me, really important to have clear goals and objectives. Although I've said that there are some teams that won't necessarily have them, they may be meeting for social reasons or whatever. Most of the time, you want to know exactly what it is you're trying to accomplish. Identify leadership roles within the team. Some teams will have an obvious leader, a manager or whatever, but in many teams, there isn't such a person. And you need to think about who is going to take on that role, because you need somebody who's going to keep meetings running and things like that. It may be, I'm going to talk about leadership a bit more in another couple of minutes. So it may be different people at different times and so on, but you do need to have somebody in a leadership role. It's really important to build relationships, because you don't have the physical interaction and so on. You still have to spend time on relationships. And it may be even more important to have a specific meeting early on that's just to talk about to each other and about each other, and to get to know each other so that you know who you are working with. Now, it's different, of course, if it's a group that you've always worked with in the workplace, but often these may be new people who you're working with. I've said there were challenges, and you may find other challenges, but so discuss the challenges, don't just overlook them. If you're having difficulty with something, tell your team members that you're having difficulty and talk about how you can solve your difficulties. We have found in our teams that having both verbal and written communication is really important. So at the end of any virtual meeting that we have written notes which we circulate so that everybody can say, yes, that's what we agreed on. And it's amazing how sometimes you do that and then you get a bunch of people who were in the same meeting saying, no, that's not what I understood. So having the written commentary afterwards allows everybody to be clear on what went on. Be specific about rewards and sanctions. Again, we have found that with virtual teams, it's especially important to reward when people do things right. So whenever we accomplish something in my teams, like we get a paper accepted or we get a book contract or something, we really make a lot of it, and we all talk about it and make sure that we all feel good about it. Because sometimes when you're not ever seeing these people in person, it's easy to get, oh, I don't know, just tired of it all. So you need something that brings you back to the importance of doing this. And similarly with sanctions, I mean, there need to be sanctions if people do not do what's expected of them. So if somebody doesn't attend team meetings regularly, or comes halfway through, or agrees to do something and doesn't do it, there has to be something specific that will result. So you have to think about what's appropriate in terms of sanctions in your situation. It'll be different in every situation. In our situation, if someone doesn't participate and we're working on a paper, then the sanction is that their name's not included as one of the authors, because they weren't. But that's known. We talked about it and we made it clear to everybody that that's what's going to happen. So everybody knows. Sharing information is really important. Everybody needs to know what's going on. If subsets of the team are working on different things, then the whole team needs to be aware of what they're working on and how they're progressing and so on. Information, I find, is difficult in our teams, not because we don't share it, we share it a lot, but we have subsets. It's quite a big team, my academic team, and so we have subsets working on different papers and different projects, and keeping track of all of that is quite difficult. We had a leader who was very good at helping us keep up with the information and sharing of information. And very sadly, she died recently. And we have found that this was just a bit of a disaster for us, because we don't all know what everybody else is doing. So apart from the disaster of losing a colleague, it's like, how do we now figure out what are all the projects that are going on? So having that information specifically is really important. I talked about rewards, but that's also sort of the celebrate successes, you know, make sure that when something goes right, that you don't just say, oh, that was supposed to happen that way, but that you really celebrate it. And meet in person wherever possible. Again, we have found for some reason that we go along fine with our virtual meetings, and then if we can get together in person, like at an international conference, we suddenly seem to make more progress. So we kind of go along at one speed, and then we meet in person and we seem to move to another level. So in-person meeting is very important. There is just something so different when you meet in person than when you meet virtually only. And finally here, to use the appropriate technology. There are, of course, many different technologies. Us as academics, we tend to use whatever we can at no cost or little cost, because we don't have much money to play with. Companies may be in a better position to, you know, get higher technology that works even better. But depending on what you want to do, there are, you know, fairly sophisticated technologies today, and it's important if you can find the best one for your purposes. So overall, the best practices are to try and maximize the benefits and minimize the effects of the challenges to make the virtual team as good as possible.
BJ, just one, with about 20 minutes to go, we have a great point coming in from Marlon. We have some conversation going on in the chat supporting a lot of what you have been speaking about. And she points out that for her team, they rotate the leadership role every couple of months in terms of who hosts and who manages the calls, who takes the issues forward to management. And they've also established a social contract as to what guides good behavior within the team.
Excellent. Those are all absolutely excellent. And when I was going to talk about leadership in another couple of slides, I was going to say that often you know, you kind of rotate it, but it has to be specific. So that's really excellent comments. Okay, now I best hurry up here. Okay, so then I said something about optics, and remember that you and everything around can be seen and heard. So when you're getting ready for a virtual team meeting, you have to first of all think about the background. And I did spend a bit of time figuring out where in my house was a reasonably good place in terms of background. Now, of course, there are standard ones that you can use. And you see these a lot on television now with all of the people, you know, working from their basements or their attics or whatever. And they almost all seem to have bookcases and books behind them. And I have come to the conclusion that it is not that they all have bookcases and books behind them, but that seems like a good background to choose if you're going to do, you know, a talk on something. I did not do that. You have to think about how you dress. You know, you have all these comics saying that they're wearing no pants. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but I hope not, because if they suddenly have to stand up for some reason, this is not going to be good. So you want, you know, you want people to still think of you as professional and so on. You obviously have to think about what you do. I mentioned the dog coming, and I was going to lean over and pat the dog, and then I tried to refrain from doing that. Right now with coronavirus, you know, we don't want to cough too much. And if we do cough, we want to do it properly because people will see what you are doing. So you have to think about that. Think about others in the household. And I, you know, mentioned the crying children or whatever. I know years ago, my husband was in a Skype meeting with a group of people, and I didn't even think about the fact that when I walked behind his chair, they would all see me. Now, fortunately, I was reasonably well dressed, so there was no problem there. But of course, I interrupted the meeting, which I had not meant to do, because they knew me, most of them, and they all suddenly said, "Oh, hello, BJ, how are you?" And then I had to talk to them. And so I had completely unintentionally interrupted their meeting. So you do have to think about all of that. Think about the noises around you. Sonia mentioned roosters the other day, and Barbados seems to have roosters who crow at the very strangest times of day. My dog loves to bark, so I have him inside where he would not be able to bark. One of the funniest stories I heard was the Supreme Court of the US was holding a virtual meeting, and after one of the members had been speaking, there was the distinct sound of the toilet flushing. Everybody thought that was very funny, and it was on all the news stories and so on. So recognize that all of those things can be heard and seen, and that what you want to aim for is to avoid distractions, because any of these are going to be distracting. So just to show you, we took this screenshot because this was when we were sort of practicing, and Sonia was showing me how to use the system and so on. That's where I normally have my computer, but we felt that that was not a good place because of the window behind and the lighting, particularly if it's very sunny, the lighting is not good. So that's when I then decided to spend a bit of time trying out different places in the house to find somewhere that we thought would work better. Okay, this is just a little cute cartoon about meetings. So, you know, I said that you had to have the right technology. And so we have the guy in the back who's asleep. And this person is saying, the video and web meeting technology cost a fortune, but people aren't using it. Why? They say it's boring and lacks interaction. Oh, just like our face-to-face meetings then. So if the meetings are not working, maybe the problem is not the technology. Maybe you have to think about the meetings themselves. So there's a great video. It's an old video, but it's a very funny video called Meetings, Bloody Meetings. And down at the bottom here, I have the website where you can get it. And it just has really great advice on running effective meetings. So I just put down a few points. Have a good detailed agenda, what you want to achieve, why you want to achieve it, what the objectives are. And he says particularly that it should be not just notes, but enough information that everybody knows what it is you're looking to do. That you have to think about the time frame for anything on the agenda. And if it's important, then the amount of time spent on it should go up. If it's not important, then make sure that you deal with it quickly. Everybody should have all the necessary information for decisions. I've been to meetings in person at UE where something comes up for discussion, and then we get passed out a report that's 20 pages long, and you don't have time to read it. But that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. We should have the information beforehand so that we're ready to make decisions. A leader, again, is really important, or maybe just a moderator to keep the meeting moving. Otherwise, people get sidetracked and talk about all kinds of things that aren't meant to be talked about in the meeting. Also, a note taker so that you can share the results. So a record of what was discussed, but basically action minutes so that you can focus on the things that were decided. Having enough time for everyone to contribute and be heard, but also not letting someone give a speech. I've been at other meetings where somebody didn't want to just be concise, but wanted to go on talking and talking and talking. You have to be able to stop them, as well as being sure that everybody can contribute. And then that one may sound a bit strange, but I came across the terminology in one paper that I was reading, a stop the train emergency lever. So this is something that somebody can say if they find they're not following the discussion. This is particularly important if everybody doesn't speak English. Somebody may get lost in terms of the discussion, and you need to agree that if they say stop, then you're going to stop and go a bit slower and so on. So meetings, whether they're in person or virtual, have to be properly managed. And the whole idea is just to think it through, make sure you do all the right things and so on. Okay, so language, I wanted, again, very quickly just to point out that in many, particularly global virtual teams, and this comes from our experience, English is used as the common language for the team because it's the only language that everybody is reasonably fluent in. But the point is that for people where it's not their first language, they may have problems. So some team members might find it difficult to follow verbal discussions. This is one of the reasons for summing up with written comments. Some team members may be reluctant to contribute. I know my Spanish is very little and halting, and if I were in a discussion in Spanish, I would be very reluctant to contribute because I would feel that I'd make a fool of myself. Some team members may feel left out because they don't feel they can contribute and they don't feel they're really following what's going on. And for those people who are fluent in English, they may think that somebody who's a bit slow and halting in English is in fact slow. But of course, that's not the case. So be very, very careful about how you think about these things. So you really do need explicit allowances to overcome these things. Again, if team members are having difficulty with the language, you go slower. You maybe say things in different ways. So I know when I taught in China, when I taught in English, and I recognized that a lot of the students were not fluent in English. In fact, they had their dictionaries and were trying to look up what I was saying. I would repeat the same thing, but using different words. So it would give them an opportunity to hear it in different ways, and hopefully they would understand one or the other. Okay, finally then, leadership tends to be horizontal rather than hierarchical. So it tends to not be a manager and then a bunch of people under them. Maybe dispersed through the team. You may well have different people who take on the role for different reasons. Different people can lead at different times and for different reasons. It's often sort of non-directive, largely coordination rather than the normal supervisor-subordinate kind of relationship. Social leadership in virtual teams is especially important. So somebody needs to be aware of how the other team members are feeling, how they're contributing, whether they're comfortable, those kinds of things. And you need to deal with potential personal and cultural differences and conflicts. In terms of cultural differences, that's fairly obvious. Some people are happy with everybody talking at once. Other cultures like people to talk one at a time and so on. But personal differences are also really important because some people are, as I said, comfortable with virtuality, other people are not. And so you have to be aware of those things. And so in the context of sort of making all of that happen, leadership really is critical to success. Now, I did come across something specific to the coronavirus, and this was from the Society for Human Resource Management. They felt that remote work will become a widely accepted alternative to location-based work, that finding talent will become easier as new hires will be available globally via remote work, that virtual learning will expand dramatically so that employees can develop their skills in less time. I was very interested at the beginning when someone responded, or I think a couple of people responded, that they were using this time to improve their skills. So that's what we think will be happening. Actual virtual reality will advance so that employees can work more collaboratively through common viewing. This one I thought was interesting. I wouldn't particularly have thought of it myself, but telemedicine will spread as companies and employees recognize the value of distance care. So if we won't have to go to the doctor anymore, they'll be able to see us online. And that generally employers will become more fiscally conservative than they were in the 2010s. So that's what Sherm thinks will be happening. And then just to wrap up, I would say that as an employee, as a team member working from home, it's a good idea to set yourself a schedule, one that suits you, but a regular schedule, to identify a workplace, so have a place excuse me, that is comfortable and that works for you. To remember to take regular breaks. It's probably a good idea to wear your Fitbit or some other type of watch that reminds you once an hour that you should get up and walk around a bit. To communicate very regularly with your team members and with your managers. So even if you don't have a particular meeting, make sure that members and your managers hear from you and know what's going on. At the same time, to recognize that work has changed when you're working from home. We all know that change can be difficult, and this is just as difficult as any other change. Some people are going to feel really lonely, isolated, and not sure of their performance. If you're accustomed to having others around you who kind of comment on what you're doing and your performance, it can be very difficult when you don't have that. And the best advice I have found everywhere in terms of dealing with this is to be kind to yourself. Okay? This is difficult for some people, and you sort of have to do your best. I have heard some reports of people who are homeschooling who found that it simply was not working for their children. And they said, okay, so the kids may get a little behind, but that's all right. We will learn in other ways. And they do their arithmetic when they're cooking, and they, you know, they make sure the kids learn about multiplying by saying, okay, if we're going to double this recipe, how much does that mean? And things like that. So sometimes you can find alternatives. From a manager's perspective, I said, make sure you plan with the team, establish goals and objectives, and provide support and advice. You have to establish trust. You have to believe that the people in the team actually are going to work. It's very tempting for some people to feel if you're out of sight, you can't possibly be working. So the trust in the team members is really important. Again, communicating regularly so that they're in touch, celebrate successes, and then use appropriate controls and measures. So if you focus on results rather than effort, then so long as you're getting the results you want, you know the person is working. And if they're not getting the results you want, then you talk to them about it and find out what the problem is. So essentially to avoid micromanaging. Again, some of the reports around at the moment are about managers who are so concerned that their virtual teams aren't actually working but are off having a good time, that they actually try to watch what they're doing and watch their screens and watch their mouse clicks and so on, which they would never do in the office. So it's something to avoid. And again, to recognize that work has changed, that people may lack structure and they may have difficulty performing, so that as a manager, your role is to help them with that and to help them deal with the change and acclimatize and in fact do well. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Before we wrap up, BJ, if anybody has questions, feel free to post them in the chat. We do have a couple minutes for questions, and we already have one from Gregory. I'm going to read it as he wrote it. What legal challenges are expected from hiring people, from hiring persons? Sorry, the screen moved, so I just need to get back to the question. What legal challenges are expected from hiring persons from different jurisdictions if contractual terms are in dispute? Are Caribbean jurisdictions prepared?
I think that's a really good question, because I think it is something that companies are encountering more and more. And I guess, I'm not sure I'm answering this very well, but I guess I would say you just need to know what the requirements are in different jurisdictions. It goes back to something that I've always talked a lot about in my international business class and international business courses. Then I used to talk about it in terms of expatriates and what happened. For example, if you brought a Canadian into Barbados, did you continue to pay them on the Canadian scale, or did you pay them on the Barbados scale, or did you pay them on some, third-party scale, and what kind of benefits did they get, and all of those things. And this, in essence, is the same thing, because the person you hire in Canada, your course, may expect, say, $10,000 to teach a course, and the person in Barbados who's teaching the same course may only expect $5,000, and the person in India may only expect $2,000. And if they all teach the same course and they find out about this, then they may have legal rights to say that you discriminated and paid the Canadian more than the Bajan, more than the Indian. So I think that that's a really, really good question, and that it's something that a legal department would really have to look at to make sure that you were not going to have problems.
And a further question, thanks for that, BJ. And a further question, working from home, how do you set up the safe working environment in terms of ergonomics and having the right equipment in that space? And this is like a white elephant in the discussions with local businesses who are seeing working from home, and I am sort of changing Gregory's question a little bit, who are seeing working from home as a possibility for the short to midterm future, but don't have the financial wherewithal to ensure that those employees who will be working from home are outfitted in their home offices in the same way that they would be outfitted in their workspaces. Any comments?
Well, again,